Welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. Today I'm joined by Holli Emore, the Executive Director of Cherry Hill Seminary and author of the book Constellated Ministry. Holli, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Robin.
Now, today we're going to be ranging over a number of topics, but a good place to start would be with Cherry Hill Seminary. Could you tell us a little bit about the seminary and what its history is?
Yes, thank you. The seminary started out as a place-based school for, witchcraft skills and that sort of thing in Vermont. And I haven't been able to identify the exact year, but it was sometime in maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. And within a few years, it was discovered that there was some software that would allow classroom participation online, which would open it up to anyone. And people began to brainstorm and have a desire to have some more professional training with an eye towards pagan ministry. So that was the beginning. We were incorporated as a nonprofit with the federal government in 2005. I was brought on board as executive director, I think in January 2008. And we're just thrilled to still be here. It's hard to stay above water as a pagan institution, but we've now graduated, I think, 6 or 7 Masters of Divinity students and a lot of people in the past with former certificates. And then we've got about 12 or 15 people who've completed a certificate of a community ministry certificate. We call it a CMC, which is for non-graduate studies. And it's a mentored individual study program. And we've got other programs too. I hope your listeners might visit us online, cherryhillseminary.org.
We'll put a link in the show notes, certainly.
Thank you. And
I believe that you're the only seminary at the moment within the neo-pagan movement, certainly within the English-speaking world.
Well, there are some other schools, at least a couple or so, that use the word seminary, but we are an actual graduate program. Now, we are not accredited. That's a very arduous and expensive process that we continue to prepare for, but that's going to be quite a mountain to climb. But meanwhile, we have worked for years to meet those same standards. And we are legally allowed to award degrees in a religious area. So we keep in touch with our official state oversight here. But yeah, we're the only graduate program we're aware of.
Okay. And the people who come to you, is there a split between those who are interested in studying from an academic point of view and those who are interested in studying for ministry?
Yes, I would say most of our students have an interest in the academics, but the majority come to us because they want to serve their communities, or they already are and they want to do a better job. We offer a Master of Pagan Studies, which is not a Master of Divinity. An MDiv includes internship, maybe a program at a hospital or a prison, or various types of internship that are more of a residency. But the academic studies, I think we have a strong theology and religious studies department, and a section of those courses is required for all our master's students, whether they're planning an active ministry of some kind or not.
Okay. Turning to the place of ministry in the neo-pagan movement, paganism is in its modern form a young tradition, and one that's very much still evolving. And the evolution of ministry is part of that broader evolution. Would it be fair to say that, just as in other religions, the nature of what it means to be a priest or a member of the clergy has been debated and has changed over the years, that this is a matter of debate, a matter of contention, something of a moving target?
Yes, it is. And there's the conundrum that drove me to my thesis studies a few years ago. We are so individualistic, and we really prize the personal journey, spirituality. But we are also human, and I feel that implies a need for community for survival, if nothing else. So I found myself thinking, okay, I've worked at Cherry Hill for years. I was a nonprofit consultant for a long time. And I wondered, what would you say are best practices for pagan ministry? Well, no one's ever established that because it is such a new field. And you're right, it's a hotly contested term. What does ministry mean? What is a minister? What is clergy? What's a priest? Well, I think most of us can agree that a priest in the contemporary pagan context is a role that's typified by ritual. In ministry, I tend to think of as more of the engagement with those who need spiritual support. And those two roles usually overlap, but not always. We have imprinted on us this idea of a minister, what Christians might call a pulpit minister, liturgical churches might call a priest, an imam, a rabbi, somebody that is connected with a place. And they are looked to as the leader, even though there may be so-called lay leaders in addition. But this is a huge responsibility. There's a reason that churches with more funding and members have associate ministers and a minister of pastoral care and a minister of education and that sort of thing, because it's a huge job. And I think almost any coven leader will agree with that. So I had those thoughts rattling around. And at the same time, I'm very conscious that both Helen Berger's and Gwendolyn Reese's research over the past, say, 10 years almost always come up with arguably up to 80% of pagans in America, at least, calling themselves solitary. And I thought, okay, is that because they want to be solitary? Or is it just because they have no access to a group? And if they want to be solitary, do they ever want somebody to be there to provide spiritual support? So that became the focus of a survey I did for my thesis. What I learned was that among my respondents, and there were about 2,200, it was a good sample. Now, some of those were from a number of other countries, including Great Britain. But I decided to focus on the American sample, which is fairly related to your listeners, I should think. What I found was that most people wish they could be part of a group. That kind of surprised me. But what I also learned is everybody has their own definition of what that means. They named everything from a regular place-based group that meets for various things to they would mark themselves as being a member of a group. And then later in the survey, they'd say, oh, my group is a Facebook page. So I found that there are wandering definitions of group affiliation among pagans. And I would want to take that into account if I were ever to do follow-up research of that sort. But meanwhile, a lot of researchers, not necessarily pagan, have looked at these changing numbers. There's a very rapidly shifting landscape of religiosity in America. church affiliation has been pretty much a central feature of American communities, to the point that, for example, African American congregations have always been the rallying places for activism for civil rights. And that membership is declining each year. Until last year, the numbers showed that it was still rising among evangelical Christians. Now that number has started to decline as well. But we also find that more and more people identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, or blended spiritualities, or they really are not big on definition. I found that a lot of people, and this includes pagans as well, come from a mixed religious family. So those kinds of interfaith and interspiritual relationships are really what I see as the future of anything that we do. And for that reason, at Cherry Hill, we do require a course in interfaith leadership for our Masters of Divinity students. And I think it's going to redefine how everyone does ministry from here on out.
Okay. Going back to something you were saying, there's sometimes an assumption, isn't there, in the pagan community, that people who are solitary practitioners are taking that path through choice because they're individualists and so forth. But it sounds like in many cases it's something that's forced upon them.
I think that's true. Of course, there are some people that just want to be left alone. I also find that they will call you up when they suddenly have a death close to them, or, for some reason they realize they feel the need for some kind of support. Maybe they remember, oh, Holli is into that kind of thing. I'm going to call her. So I have people of all kinds of backgrounds, not just pagan, contact me. My nephew is reconsidering his gender identity. Do you know of a counselor who would be good for our family to go to so we can support him in that? People contact me to ask about divorce attorneys who understand paganism and won't use that against somebody in a child custody case. So, people have different needs at different times in their lives.
Okay. And that brings us on, I think, to this concept of constellated ministry, which, as I mentioned, is the title of your book. Now, this is a metaphor drawn from the stars, isn't it? Constellations of stars. And this is a metaphor for encounters, isn't it? Between individual pagans and people carrying out ministry in different situations.
Right. I had sort of an awakening one day when I was still crunching all of this information, that each star is a point of entry, either for us to the community or to others or vice versa. And I remembered that, for example, the Egyptians saw the same stars that, say, the Babylonians did, but they created different pictures from them. But anyway, that just reminded me that you can look and see one grouping of stars, and then another time somebody else may see a different grouping. It's the same stars. And it just made me begin to think about the flexibility that's required to serve our communities now. I don't think that pagans can impose our desire to serve on other pagans, but we need to make ourselves available if we feel that we have those skills and training. And so how do we do that? And that's where I talk about various channels, none of which are rocket science or which most of us aren't using already, but thinking of that as points of contact and ways to be accessible is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and it seems to me that this work in many cases is based on a chaplaincy model, which is to say in situations such as hospitals or prisons or the military, rather than a model which is centered on a geographical congregation, a local parish church or temple or synagogue.
That's right. And in chaplaincy, we have a saying that if you're a minister or clergy of some kind, it's about your religion. You know, you obviously are representing your path. When you're a chaplain, it's about the other person. So you're there to provide the support that they need. Now, pagan chaplains are often requested. For example, I got a request from New York University yesterday. They're looking for someone to serve on their campus who can be there for the pagan students. So they're specifically looking for a pagan chaplain, but a chaplain is supposed to be prepared to take care of whoever turns up with a need. In fact, even when people want to speak with a chaplain, they don't necessarily want to talk about religion. They just kind of want to feel that you're there for them and be reminded that there is something constant and they will get through this. So those are important distinctions to make.
Okay. When modern pagans look for resources to draw on in creating a model of ministry, where do those resources tend to come from? Are they taken from ancient pagan societies? Are they repurposed from established religions such as Christianity? Are they influenced by modern indigenous societies? I imagine the answer is probably a combination.
I really think it is. And I think we've had this problematic relationship with our religious pasts. And understandably so. There's been a lot of abuse, but, you know, there's also been abuse in the pagan community. We can't throw babies out with the bathwater. And I finally had to admit to myself some years after deciding I was pagan that most of my values came from my Baptist grandmother and what I learned in the Bible, which was, you know, what some people might call the sandbox rules. Be nice to each other. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. But yeah, you know, I mentioned the example of Osiris in my book. So I think we can look back and pick out these themes, although whatever we were acculturated with is probably going to be the lens through which we look at everything. So we don't have to reject that entirely. But I think the more we learn, the more we're able to integrate and discriminate different approaches. For those who haven't read the book, I mentioned that Osiris in the myth dies. And I compare him to the Fisher King, whose wound just festers and the land suffers while he continues to not be healed. Osiris is brought back to temporary life by Isis and then becomes god of the afterlife. And in another part of that myth, he is dismembered into pieces by his murderer. And Isis has to go and search for each piece and put him back together first. So my thought is that there are some of us who just feel compelled to be there for others. That can certainly go in a toxic direction. But I think for a grounded, mature person, that's an impulse towards serving our community that helps to be a cohesive force for all of us. And I mentioned the Osiris thing because there is a need to bind up all those broken pieces. Some of us are broken. You know, that old expression, the wounded healer. Some say that we can't really be effective in sharing healing with others until we have experienced it ourselves.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is something that Ronald Hutton wrote about in The Triumph of the Moon. And he had Wicker in mind specifically here. Wicker, of course, was originally fully initiatory. It was based on small groups of people who were initiated in covens. But over time, it developed a penumbra of people who were interested in it and who attended events such as open rituals, for example, but didn't take the step of becoming initiated. And Ronald Hutton suggested these people came to treat initiated Wiggins as a clergy, as if they had a kind of ministerial status. Is that something that you've come across?
I'm not sure I have observed that here. This may be another one of those places where the landscape in America may be a little bit different. I mean, this is where we have Scott Cunningham and Raymond Buckland come along in the early 80s and publish things. And so for the first time, people who didn't have access any other way could teach themselves something about witchcraft and practice it.
But even so, you do get leader-type figures emerging, don't you?
As pagans, we say that we do not like to put anybody on a pedestal. And we believe in sort of this priesthood of all. But the truth is that we tend to go in for a fair amount of celebrity culture. And I find that's unfortunate because it simply means that the celebrity has gotten more public exposure. Now, happily, there are people who are well known, who are also very wise and helpful for us, but in some cases that's not been true. So these group dynamics are really important when you are looking at do you want to serve your community? In what way? Do you need a group? I have an acquaintance who's a rabbi in another state, and he refers to himself as a rabbi at large. And he will get calls from Jews who have been agnostic or not practicing, and they're facing cancer, and they know they've got 3 months to die or to live until they die. And so they want him to come and do some prayers with them and help them get ready for their death. So things like that. I also would like to mention that my little Kemetic group, Temple Osirian, a few years ago, realized that we had put on some events for the interfaith community here in South Carolina. And we're pleasantly surprised by how enthusiastically we were received and how people from various religions enjoyed coming and doing something with us. They did not feel threatened, neither did we. So one winter solstice, we decided to invite friends who had expressed interest or had attended something in the past. And we said, come join us for a short ceremony and candle lighting, and we'll have dessert and coffee afterwards. Well, we had a house full, and they loved it. And they came back for the couple of years that we were able to do it before COVID came. So when we did it virtually this year, we opened it up and we posted it on social media. So I use that as an example of that group. One person is an active member of the atheist community here. One person was Wiccan many, many years ago and kind of drifted away from it. Somebody is Buddhist. Another couple are Catholic. So there's a lot of potential for building community and building alliances that are in, as you say, that penumbra of people that don't necessarily consider themselves pagan, but they're drawn to it, or they find nourishment, or they think of themselves pretty much as pagan, but they're like the Methodist who doesn't go to church, So that they're glad to know that we're there, and they enjoy gathering with us periodically. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate role. I had to learn that not everybody needs the same thing spiritually, and that some people just don't even need religion at all.
Yeah. one concept that you come across from time to time in the world of modern paganism is the concept of an elder, which seems to be an idea or a title which sort of spontaneously develops and is spontaneously given to particular people who happen to be respected. Is that something that you would say relates to the concept of ministry within the pagan community?
I think it can. I think the definition of elder for pagans is another thing that's kind of all over the place. I've known, for example, women's groups who decided they were going to go through a year or a 2-year study, and then they all held croning ceremonies for each other at the end of that. Other places put an age limit on it. I don't think that a particular age grants you, all of us, the same wisdom or experience. I'm 66. At 66, I only thought of myself as an elder with a lowercase e in some kind of context last year. I can't even remember what. And I went, oh. And I thought, I don't need another title, but I think we need to respect and recognize those among us who have been there for us and who've provided role models.
Yeah, I mean that's a purely informal title and concept, but there is something to be said for the formality of the sort of courses that you have at Cherry Hill Seminary, where people do go through a particular process of learning and are given a kind of, I won't say a seal of approval, but are given a qualification at the end.
Yeah, at the very least, if someone wants to use you as a volunteer or hire you for their hospital, they know that you've had a particular skill set of learning. And they know that you've studied your own religion a good bit, and they assume that you know a little something about other religions. And you don't get that overnight. You're not going to earn a master's degree at age 19 or 20, not where I live. So I think it automatically implies that it takes time to season and age. There is a term from the wider religious community called spiritual formation. And that's an important piece of a seminary education, although it's not a specific seminary function, but you are expected to develop and figure out who you are, basically. Figure out what are the things that you need to work on, learn about yourself so that those are not distractions in the future when you're working with other people, so that they can, even your weaknesses can become an asset by you recognizing them and figuring out how you deal with them. If someone asked me what's the most important skill for ministry, I would have to say it's not really a skill, it's a quality, and that's compassion. That trumps everything. And by compassion, I don't mean being a sucker for every person that comes along. It doesn't mean trying to be all things to all people or doing everything, but it's just an attitude of seeing what we pagans say, that we see the divine in everything, that we see creation as manifest, sacred. So we should treat others that way. And if you want to call that a golden rule, fine. Whatever it is, I think we've got to treat each other and our world as we wish to be treated or better. And the other things will flow from that.
Indeed. And as to the people who pass through Cherry Hill Seminary, do you keep in touch with them? Do you keep a record of what they're doing and what forms of ministry and so forth they've gone into?
We haven't had a formal way of following up, but we do stay in touch with folks, and we have an active alumni group called Votary Circle. as I said to someone last week, I met with someone who was finishing up their CMC, their community ministry certificate. And I said, I can't believe that we're finished with this process, but that doesn't mean you have to be finished with Cherry Hill. You're part of our seminary family. And we're always here if you need us. And of course, we have other programs. We have things like the Coming to the Center live stream interviews with pagan scholars and thought leaders. So we do encourage people to remain engaged. It's not often that you're able to find a really good, supportive, widespread pagan network. Most of our students, even though we're a completely digital campus, we have a lot of people who become close friends. They stay friends. They stay in touch with each other. They help each other out as well as you can by distance. Of our handful of MDiv graduates, one did eventually completely retire, but she did several years of chaplaincy at mental hospitals, I believe. Another person does pastoral counseling on request, and another person has become part of our faculty, and she also serves as a mentor in the CMC program. I'm one of those graduates. Oh, and then still another person is a paid hospital chaplain.
Okay. And I imagine that there will be an expanding population of alumni in the future.
We certainly hope so. I don't think human needs are going to change that much. The shape of them may look different, but people still need each other. They still need help and support, or just kind of some guidance. Somebody called me a few months ago and he said, I know we haven't gotten to this part in my program, but we just had our key leader have a stroke and go into the hospital, and he's on life support. So I'm up there supporting both his family and our group, and we're all torn up about it. And I feel I'm having to be strong for everybody. And I know that they've got to disconnect him soon, and we'll be doing a funeral. Do you have any advice? So, those are the kinds of things we're there for people, and that's important.
Yeah. As the final question, let's look into the future, and let's look at the question of how pagan ministry might develop in the future. One thing that you say in the book is that you don't expect to see a professional, full-time paid ministry develop. What future would you see for the pagan ministry? Unfortunately,
I don't foresee a time soon when we would be able to support paid clergy in the way we've seen other religions do. But I also know, and I've interviewed a number of ministers of other religions, they are also struggling. In fact, there's this concept they call tent making, your job that pays the bills on the side of your ministry. So everybody is struggling with how to do this. And that's why I think a constellated approach, which is very flexible, is so important, because one person, two people cannot be all things to all people. An important piece that I describe in my book is to develop your allies, both pagan and non-pagan. Get out there and meet people in your community, because one of these days you're going to need each other.
Indeed. And that's a good note, I think, on which to end. Holli Emore, thank you very much for being with us today. I appreciate you taking the time to talk.
Thank you, Robin. This has been my pleasure.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.